The cold, dense air of early morning touched my face as we moved silently through Yellowstone Park. Something in the atmosphere seemed to move with us, peering from behind the trees. I'd never felt such a paralyzing cold. The vastness of the park, usually fascinating for any nature lover, exuded a suffocating heaviness that day. An almost physical, invisible weight made each step more treacherous. At that moment, I had no idea what was about to unfold. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, Michael and I arrived at an area covered in thick, black mud. At first, it seemed like an ordinary muddy patch, but something about it was strange, something that seemed to draw my attention. The color was unnatural, and its texture clashed with the surroundings. Michael watched me curiously as I crouched down to inspect the area. I started to dig slowly, moving the mud with my hands, and that's when I touched something solid, something metallic, buried under the muck. A rusty iron hatch emerged from the mud, like a secret hidden beneath the earth's skin. Michael and I exchanged a glance. We both knew this didn't make sense, an iron door in the middle of a national park. I hesitated, listening to the rustling leaves around us, as if the park itself was whispering for us to turn back. But Michael, ever fearless, insisted. On impulse, we grabbed the hatch and began to pull, feeling the cold metal under our fingers. When we finally opened the hatch, a nauseating smell seeped from the hole. The stench seemed trapped there for decades, thick with damp, rust, and something else, something indescribable. Michael shone his flashlight into the opening, revealing a spiraling staircase descending into darkness. I wanted to retreat, to return to the park's safety in the dawn's gray light, but he was already descending, determined to explore. His flashlight illuminated rust-stained walls as I hesitated at the top. I descended behind him, each step taking me farther from the surface, from the sky and the wind that still blew above. The sensation of leaving safety behind was overwhelming. The silence was broken only by our muffled footsteps echoing against the damp, cold walls. Finally, we reached the bottom, and what I saw there took my breath away. There were hallways, rooms, and a heavy silence. The place looked abandoned, but also felt as if it was waiting for something or someone. As I entered one of the rooms, I realized we were in a place that shouldn't exist, a secret buried beneath Yellowstone's rock. My heart raced, each beat like a drum in my ears. What I found there shook me to my core. It was as if I had discovered a hidden side of the world, one where humanity's rules were forgotten. I understood that this laboratory was not just a secret, but a threat, something that should never see the light of day. Since childhood, I had always been fascinated by the earth and its mysteries. While other children played, I was focused on each rock, each grain of dirt. I remember how the different textures and colors of the stones told stories only I seemed to understand. There was something magical about that silent and unchanging world. My obsession with stones and minerals, unusual to many, was to me like secrets waiting to be revealed. Michael was my best friend and partner in these adventures. He didn't share my obsession with minerals, but loved the thrill of exploration. Our summers were spent in forests, and our only rule was to keep going and never look back. I would dive into the study of rocks, while Michael always sought the hardest path. He would laugh at my seriousness, but always followed me, no matter how far I wanted to go. Over time, what began as curiosity turned into something much bigger. I realized I wanted to dedicate my life to studying the earth, and Michael always encouraged me. So I decided to study geology, knowing that I might spend my life analyzing rocks and soil in laboratories. But the idea of uncovering Earth's secrets was irresistible. While others chose more conventional careers, my calling was to explore what lay beneath our feet. Geology became my life. Each new discovery brought a difficult-to-explain euphoria. The smell of earth, the weight of minerals in my hands, and the promise of revealing ancient secrets kept me going. Michael, on the other hand, followed a different path but never hesitated to join me on my more remote expeditions. It was as if his adventurous spirit completed my scientific fascination. Together, we were the perfect mix of rationality and intuition. Then the opportunity to explore Yellowstone came. As soon as I heard, my heart raced. It was a unique chance, a childhood dream about to come true. I knew I couldn't pass it up, and to my surprise, Michael insisted on joining me. We were excited, as if the old spark of our childhood expeditions had reignited. It would be an adventure, but this time with consequences beyond our imagination. As we moved forward in the expedition, I realized that my passion for geology would lead me to face something I had never imagined. Yellowstone's soil held dangerous secrets, and I was about to discover the biggest one. At first, it was mere scientific curiosity, But as we got closer, a dark premonition began to follow me. I looked at Michael and saw in his eyes the same mix of excitement and fear. I knew that once we found what we were looking for, nothing would ever be the same. When we reached deeper into Yellowstone's remote area, our steps were interrupted by a figure emerging from the trees. It was a tall, weary-looking man wearing a dirty, torn uniform. He walked with a heavy gait, as if always on guard, carrying the weight of secrets that couldn't be shared. Upon seeing us, his expression hardened, and a chill ran down my spine. Without saying a word, he already seemed to want to keep us away. He introduced himself as George Mason, a park ranger, but something about his demeanor didn't fit. There was tension in his every movement, as if we were trespassing in a forbidden place. He looked over our equipment and then at us, frowning. The dark aura around him made me uneasy. Mason warned us that it wasn't safe for us to be there and vaguely mentioned the zone of death. His words hung heavily in the air, ominous and final. Michael, as curious as ever, asked what he meant by the zone of death. Mason's reaction was unexpected. He lowered his voice, looking around as if fearing someone might hear. He briefly explained that the Yellowstone sector in Idaho was known as such because, according to rumors, it was a place where the law held no effect. He said it was easy to get lost there, and that many who entered simply didn't return. The tone of his voice suggested more than just warnings. When we tried to ask more, Mason fell silent. He looked at us with an expression that seemed to pierce our skin, seeing something that even we couldn't. He then turned and disappeared into the darkness among the trees. We stood there, trying to absorb what we had just heard. His words left a heavy unease, as if something in Yellowstone was alive and dangerous. At that moment, the tension began to grow between Michael and me. Despite Mason's warning, we decided to continue. Michael was thrilled, seeing it as a mystery to solve. I, however, felt the weight of the ranger's warning in every step. The air felt thicker, the silence of the trees deeper. I had the feeling that something was watching our movements. But curiosity overpowered our fear, and we continued, as if drawn into an invisible trap. Thus, George Mason's figure became a shadow in our minds, a presence we couldn't ignore. I wondered why he was there and what he meant with his warnings. It seemed he held a secret bigger than any geological mystery. Something told me we shouldn't be there, but there was no turning back. Something in that area seemed to call us, and even with Mason's warning, we continued, unable to resist whatever awaited us. That morning was cloudy, and a persistent drizzle made the ground slippery. We walked until we reached an area where the soil was unusually muddy, forming a swamp of a deep gray tone. Michael was the first to notice a metal structure partially buried in the mud. He called to me with a tone mixed with excitement and fear. There was something hidden there, deliberately concealed under that dense, sticky layer of mud. It didn't belong to the park's natural environment. Curious yet cautious, I knelt beside Michael, removing the mud with my hands, trying to uncover what lay beneath. My fingers found something hard, cold, and metallic, which made me shiver. We kept digging until part of a metallic hatch emerged before us. It was a solid structure, visibly old, and anything but natural. Michael and I exchanged a look of surprise and unease. The question lingering between us was, who had built it here and why? The hatch seemed part of a hidden facility, something that no one was meant to find. I hesitated for a moment, wondering what might be on the other side. A sense of warning washed over me, as if the park itself was sending us a message to retreat. However, Michael seemed more determined than ever. With a strange gleam in his eyes, he suggested we open the hatch, convinced there was a secret inside worthy of any explorer. Reluctantly, I agreed, helping Michael lift the heavy metal door. The sound of creaking iron echoed through the park, contrasting with the crushing silence around us. As the hatch opened, stagnant air escaped, carrying a sharp smell of rust and something else I couldn't identify. It was a dense, unpleasant smell, as if time and darkness had rotted whatever lay below. A shiver ran down my spine. Descending the rusty staircase, I felt each step taking us further from the surface and from what I considered safe. Michael's flashlight illuminated only a few meters ahead, revealing an underground corridor that seemed to stretch indefinitely. The feeling of invading a forbidden place grew with every step. The damp, worn walls seemed to whisper stories from decades past. I had the distinct impression that we shouldn't be there. At the bottom of the stairs, we faced a double door that opened with a gentle push, revealing what seemed to be an old laboratory. The room had a sinister quality, as if the walls harbored the horrors of cruel experiments. Darkness blended with the faint glow of yellowed lights, and the silence was oppressive. I felt a tightness in my chest as I saw dust-covered tables, corroded instruments, and papers still lying on shelves. We stood before a hidden and forgotten secret, one that should never have been found. The environment we found was dark and desolate, like a cemetery of machines and steel instruments. The laboratory had a cold, functional architecture, with raw concrete walls and metal floors that echoed every step. The lighting was weak, making every corner a threat, every shadow a mystery. There was a suffocating aura in the air, as if something in that atmosphere could break even the bravest of men. My throat tightened as I looked around, trying to understand what this place was. Michael, always fearless, was excited by the discovery, but something in my instincts screamed that this place was dangerous. With each room we passed, a new sense of oppression took hold of me. The dirty walls, the stained floor, and the smell of moisture intensified the uncomfortable atmosphere. This wasn't just an old laboratory. It was a place where time had stopped, where unspeakable experiments were abandoned in a rush, as if even their creators feared what was hidden there. On the shelves, dusty vials held substances of disturbing colors and viscosities. Documents scattered randomly suggested that the place had been used for something far beyond what one could imagine in a national park. Opening a drawer, Michael found a clipboard full of encrypted notes and charts that made no sense. At that moment, the thought that we were in forbidden territory began to solidify in my mind. This was a place meant to be hidden, not explored. Then I realized the laboratory wasn't completely deactivated. A room in the back showed signs of recent activity, new tools, electronic equipment still in good condition, and a faint buzzing sound that seemed to come from the ventilation system. The revelation froze me. Someone had been there recently, and for some reason, they'd left it behind. The question that echoed in my mind was, why? What were they trying to hide so deeply, to the point of leaving the place in this state? Looking at Michael, I saw he shared the same feeling of apprehension, but also a near-insane excitement. For him, this was the pinnacle of any exploration he could imagine, but for me, it was becoming a nightmare. The air grew heavier by the second, the place's pungent smell seemed to intensify, and a feeling of despair began to mingle with fear. I tried to keep calm, but it was clear that any discovery there would only bring more uncertainty and horrors. With each step, we delved deeper into the secrets of that laboratory. Neither of us spoke, as if words could awaken something dormant in the environment. The silence was interrupted only by the sound of our breathing and the echo of our footsteps. It all felt like a bad dream, a descent into an abyss from which there might be no return. And the most terrifying part was that I felt we were getting closer to discovering the true purpose of this place, and I feared what that might mean for us. On one of the lab tables, I found a pile of yellowed papers, disorganized, covered in a fine layer of dust. As I leafed through them, I realized they were classified CIA documents, with the title Project Ultra stamped at the top. The words, incomprehensible and encoded in parts, revealed only fragments of a story that should never have left the shadows. As I read, my body's temperature seemed to drop. Michael, beside me, was motionless, his eyes fixed on those forbidden words. The documents indicated that Project Ultra involved experiments on humans, something that sounded like a perversion of all we knew about ethics and science. They detailed the use of psychotropic drugs on human subjects, handpicked from the vulnerable population. I read with horror about the devastating effects of the substances used, altering the brain and body in unimaginable ways. It was as if they were trying to create something new, something that transcended the human condition. And there I was, reading it as if it were fiction. With each page I turned, my stomach churned. The descriptions of cruel tests, where subjects were subjected to increasing doses of experimental substances, were monstrous, transforming them into aggressive and irrational beings. The pages included disturbing images of deformed faces, empty eyes, and mouths twisted in agony. In those photos, the subjects no longer looked human. They were shadows of what they had once been, puppets in an experiment that seemed to have no end. Alongside the descriptions were charts detailing the project's progress. I saw that the experiments had officially been suspended years ago, but a recent note revealed that activities had resumed. A chill ran down my spine as I understood that this wasn't just the past, but the present. The project was active, perhaps in another location, maybe even in this very laboratory. Michael and I exchanged a terrified look, realizing we had uncovered something far greater than we had imagined. The files also revealed the profiles of the selected test subjects, the homeless, prisoners, and even deceived volunteers who would never leave alive. The words, dry and meticulous, described with coldness how the human mind was deconstructed and remolded under the effects of the substances. The CIA, the organization supposedly meant to protect the country, was creating horrors in human form. At that moment, I understood we had invaded a dark, perverse territory. Finishing reading, the impact of the discovery was devastating. I felt nauseous, betrayed, and completely vulnerable. This wasn't just a state secret, it was an affront to humanity itself. There was no doubt we were in danger, but I also knew that now that we knew the truth, there would be no turning back. I looked at Michael and saw the same terror reflected in his eyes. We were in possession of something that would put our lives at risk, and the weight of that knowledge was more terrifying than I could bear. As we delved deeper into the documents, each line revealed horrors greater than the last. The use of experimental drugs, according to the papers, went far beyond what we could imagine. It wasn't just about testing substances to alter the mind. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy any remnants of humanity in the subjects. The drugs were administered in increasing doses, each one more potent than the last. The goal seemed to be to create something new, something that existed beyond good and evil, a creature devoid of reason. The initial effects of the compounds were precisely described. First, the test subjects entered a state of extreme confusion, followed by bouts of aggression. Some self-harmed, others attacked those nearby. The drugs slowly corroded the minds of the volunteers, turning them into beings devoid of consciousness. The pages described convulsions and deafening screams, as if the very souls of these men were being ripped from their bodies. With each application, the symptoms intensified. In one of the images, a man seemed to be in the midst of an uncontrollable rage, his body contorted in pain. His eyes were glazed over, as if his humanity had disappeared. The drug didn't just affect the mind. It began to deform the body as well, swelling limbs and making faces appear to melt. These were grotesque mutations, as if something was growing inside them, transforming them from the inside out. The reports included descriptions of how the bodies reacted in the final stages of the experiments. One man's heart was torn apart by involuntary spasms, while another's bones fractured, as if something was twisting inside him. Disturbing photographs showed bodies twisted in agony, deformed faces, and mouths open in silent screams. In those images, the pain was almost palpable. Michael and I exchanged glances, knowing we were witnessing a nightmare come to life. The CIA seemed to have gone beyond all limits, disregarding any ethical principles. These people weren't treated as human beings, but as disposable materials, molded to the brink of survival. There was no concern for the well-being or health of those involved. Only the results mattered, the mutations. This wasn't science, it was unrestrained cruelty, a perversion of nature itself. Understanding this, my soul revolted. I knew we were facing something impossible to forget. After reading, I felt I carried a weight that could never be lifted. These files represented the death of any hope that science could be a force for good. Michael was pale, and for the first time since we began our descent, he seemed to waver. We knew this hidden lab held the materialization of the human nightmare. And more than ever, we feared that the consequences of this discovery would reach us. There was no turning back. We had seen the unimaginable, and it would never leave our minds. As we approached the lab's main area, we found an environment that looked more like a morgue than a research site. Dozens of figures were lined up, standing still with closed eyes. They were the test subjects, now known as the sleepers, beings who were once human but were now transformed. The sight was both distressing and terrifying. Michael and I froze upon seeing them there, like ghosts from the past, eternally trapped in their suffering. The sleepers seemed to be in some kind of trance. Their faces were disfigured, with open scars and pale skin. The exposed wounds on their bodies told the silent tales of the atrocities they had endured. Some still bore bite marks, as if they had attacked one another, and others had deep cuts with blood already clotted. It was a grotesque scene, an image straight out of a horror movie. We knew this wasn't fiction. It was a failed experiment, a twisted creation. As we watched these beings, something about them seemed almost alive. Their bodies showed slight tremors, as if a thread of consciousness still remained. The sound of shallow, broken breathing filled the air, creating an atmosphere of utter despair. The doubt consumed me. Were they still human, or mere puppets of a mad experiment? Michael took a step forward, hypnotized by the terror of the scene. These creatures seemed on the brink of awakening, and the fear that this might happen paralyzed me. Looking closer, I saw that their faces bore expressions of eternal pain, suffering suspended between sleep and death. Their mouths were slightly open, some with dark stains of dried blood. The scars on their bodies were silent testimonies of what they had endured. They were there, asleep, but the silence around them screamed a pain I could hardly imagine. Michael and I exchanged looks filled with terror and sadness. These were no longer human beings. They were fragments of something that should never exist. I tried to convince Michael to back away, to leave that place behind, but he seemed hypnotized by the scene. To him, it was a horrifying but irresistible discovery. I, on the other hand, felt that we were walking toward our own destruction. Each of these sleepers represented an attempt to tamper with what is sacred in human life. The idea that they might awaken and see us as a threat was unbearable. I needed to get out of there, but Michael wouldn't move. Then, a faint noise echoed down the corridor, a sound I couldn't identify. Something seemed to stir among the sleepers. Michael was too close, and before I could do anything, he muttered a tentative hello in their direction. One of the beings opened its eyes in a slow, unsettling way. Its eyes were empty, devoid of any humanity, and in an instant, the room filled with monstrous screams like a macabre chorus. In that moment, I knew we had crossed a line with no return. As the sleepers began to move, I felt my body freeze completely. The figures, once stationary like statues, now stirred, advancing rapidly and erratically. We exchanged panicked glances, and Michael shouted for us to run. The sound of our footsteps echoed in the lab's corridors, each one narrower and more claustrophobic than the last. Behind us, the sleepers moved in a silent, relentless pursuit, drawing ever closer, making the danger almost tangible. The corridors we had calmly explored earlier now felt like endless mazes, with each turn bringing new uncertainty. Michael looked back as we ran, and I could see the same terror in his eyes that paralyzed me. We needed to find an exit, but the environment around us seemed designed to keep us there. The dark walls and the muffled sound of our breathing intensified the oppressive atmosphere. We were running for our lives. Michael yanked me toward a side door, trying to find some shelter, and we managed to shut it behind us for a few moments. The room was shrouded in dense shadows, and everything around us seemed to be watching. Soon, the sleepers began pressing against the door, the wood creaking under the weight of their pushing. Michael and I exchanged desperate looks, each breathing fast and nervously. We knew time was running out, and the door wouldn't hold much longer. Michael found an improvised tool on a table and, with trembling hands, tried to hold off the sleepers. They didn't seem to back down from our efforts and kept advancing, determined to reach us. We felt the intensity of each moment, as if the air around us was charged with electricity. The pounding against the door was so intense we could almost feel the impact reverberate through our bodies. The urgency to escape was unbearable. When we finally fled the room, we resumed running through the corridors. Each movement was more tense than the last, and the weight of fear seemed to increase with every step. Michael looked at me with a gaze of mixed determination and desperation, as if he knew we had no choice but to keep going. The environment around us seemed to close in more and more, making any chance of escape even harder. The muffled sound of the sleepers still echoed behind us. Finally, we saw a faint light in the distance, indicating the lab's exit. We moved toward it, our hearts racing and senses on high alert. At that moment, we understood how much we had underestimated the dangers lurking in that place. We knew that once we crossed that door, nothing would ever be the same. The laboratory was just a shadow of what might lie ahead, and the mysteries we left behind were more frightening than either of us could bear. When we reached the lab entrance, still breathless and completely disoriented, we were met by a group of men dressed in dark uniforms and armed. They appeared in silence, blocking our way out. Michael and I exchanged uncertain looks, realizing that for some reason, they had been expecting us. The group's leader watched us with a cold, calculating expression, as if our desperation was an irrelevant detail. Before we could say anything, one of them signaled for us to remain still. "Lie down on the ground now," ordered one of the men, and we had no choice. We lay down, our breath still fast and our hearts racing. We felt the weight of the control they held over the situation, and the realization that our curiosity had led us too far weighed heavily in our minds. The agents began to move around us, and Michael and I remained silent, our gazes fixed on the cold floor, as fear and uncertainty took over. The tension in the air was almost palpable as the men watched our movements. For a few seconds, they were silent, as if pondering what to do with us. One of the agents, who seemed to be the leader, approached and looked at us with a disturbing calm. It was clear that whatever we had seen was something they wanted to keep hidden at any cost. Michael tried to begin an explanation, but he was silenced with a severe look. We were under their control. The agents began discussing among themselves in low tones, enough that we couldn't hear. The feeling of helplessness and vulnerability grew with every second as they kept us immobilized. It was as if we were in an inescapable situation, in a place where any mistake would be fatal. We knew that now we were part of a secret that should never have been discovered. Michael's eyes reflected the same fear consuming me, and a heavy silence hung between us. After a few minutes, the leader of the group approached and gave us a direct choice. We could leave, but only on the condition of absolute silence. We were never to speak of what we had seen. In exchange, they would ensure our safety, but the implied threat in his words was clear. Michael and I nodded in silence, without any real choice. The thought of sharing what we had seen was crushed under the weight of the consequences he had imposed. Without further words, the men stepped back and allowed us to go, but we knew we were being watched. Our freedom now came at an incalculable price. We would leave alive, but not entirely free. The images of the laboratory, the sleepers, and the experiments were etched into our minds, but now formed part of a dark, inescapable secret. We knew our lives would never be the same, and a bitter silence would follow us forever. A few days after our departure, we received an unexpected visit from George Mason. The imposing figure of the park ranger now bore an even more unsettling seriousness. He entered our home uninvited, his face heavy and his gaze cold, immediately revealing that he hadn't forgotten our encounter in the park. Michael and I remained silent as he settled in, waiting for him to break the silence. His presence caused us an almost physical discomfort. George began to speak in a controlled tone, but with an intensity that made it clear we were in no position to question him. He reminded us of everything we had seen and made it clear that our lives depended on our silence. There would be no second chance if the story came to light. Each word he uttered seemed to envelop us in an invisible net, an implicit contract that could not be broken. He knew we were frightened, and he used that to his advantage. Mason stated that the laboratory was an operation far beyond what we could imagine, and that any attempt to reveal it would put us in unavoidable danger. His eyes, now cold and distant, seemed to reveal extensive experience in dealing with situations like ours. He hinted that he had already handled other people who, out of curiosity, had gotten too close to similar secrets. The message was clear. In his eyes, we were just two more curious individuals he would need to keep silent. Michael tried to argue, but George quickly interrupted him. He only wanted a simple answer, a confirmation that we would remain silent. With a swift gesture, he placed an envelope on the table, stating it contained compensation for the incident. It was a substantial amount, enough to try to persuade us to forget the experience. But for us, the memory of what we had seen was irremovable. Mason knew this, but he also knew we were powerless to do anything. With every phrase George uttered, the atmosphere of tension increased, and the feeling of being trapped in a snare became more real. His visit was as much a warning as a reminder of our forced pact. The threat, now subtle, was a certainty that he or his organization would not hesitate to take drastic measures if we broke the agreement. With a final threatening glance, Mason stood up and left. His figure vanished through the door, but the weight of his words remained forever. After he left, Michael and I sat in silence. We knew that from now on, every word, every thought would be carefully watched. Mason was not just a ranger. He was the keeper of a dark secret, and we were prisoners of a forced pact. The promise of silence echoed in our minds, a shadow we had carried since that day. We knew our lives would never again be free, and the worst part was the certainty that there was nowhere to run. Some time later, I began to feel that something wasn't right. The nights became long, filled with insomnia and confusing nightmares. My body, once full of energy, now felt exhausted, as if each cell was in constant decay. Michael and I barely spoke, but the same seemed to be happening to him. The burden of the secrets we carried seemed to affect us deeply, as if the psychological weight was consuming us. It was as if we were trapped in a constant state of alert. Sleep became a challenge, and I would wake with a sense of disorientation. During the day, the exhaustion intensified, becoming a constant presence in my routine. Michael also seemed to live in a similar state. He mentioned feeling a strange unease, as if something was preventing him from fully relaxing. We spent our days with the impression that a part of us was still trapped in that lab, reliving the horrors we had witnessed. Over time, things got worse. My hands trembled slightly, and a sense of restlessness overtook me at the slightest noise. Michael described similar symptoms, like a restlessness he couldn't explain. We felt something in us was changing, and this brought a growing fear, though it was impossible to describe exactly what it was. The shadows we saw in the lab now seemed to be part of our lives, like an invisible but constant presence. Talking about what happened didn't relieve anything. On the contrary, with every word, it felt as if we were reliving everything once again. Silence between us became a routine because any mention of the lab or what we saw seemed to awaken growing anxiety. We felt that any attempt to verbalize what we had discovered would bring more problems than answers. It was as if our minds were protecting us from reliving that nightmare. With time, even our friends and family noticed something was wrong, but we never told the truth. We only mentioned that the work had been more intense than expected, that maybe we had caught a virus during the expedition. But deep down, we knew that experience had left a profound mark. It was a secret that seemed to slowly eat away at us, a living memory that refused to fade, like a dark reflection we carried in our minds. In the solitude of our thoughts, we understood that we would never be the same. The discovery of something so beyond human understanding placed us in a position of helplessness. The physical and psychological changes were a reflection of the horror we had witnessed, and what we saw in the lab haunted us in an inescapable way. We knew that our curiosity had exacted a high price, and we feared that this sensation was only the beginning of something much larger. Months passed since the incident, but the weight of the experience in Yellowstone never ceased to haunt my days. With each moment of stillness, my mind would return to that lab, to the smell of metal and dampness, to the suffocating silence of the abandoned rooms. The mark left by all of it was far from fading, like a persistent shadow. Michael and I rarely spoke about what we saw, but we knew we were both prisoners of the same memories and the same promise of silence. At times, I felt I was drifting away from who I was. Memories of the lab would suddenly surface, like flashes, bringing an intense sense of dread and isolation. Michael confessed to experiencing the same sensations, describing periods of sleeplessness, during which the image of the sleepers would appear in his mind, as if he were still trapped in that nightmare. It was a disturbing sensation, almost as if the secret we carried had become part of us. The worst, however, was the uncertainty of what lay ahead. George Mason's promise, the veiled threat of constant surveillance, was an almost tangible presence in our lives. We felt that any slip, any poorly chosen word, could put us in danger again. Every unexpected call, every unusual letter reminded us that we were under constant watch. It was a silent prison, built around the memory of what we had seen and the fear of what could happen if we spoke. Gradually, the physical and psychological symptoms worsened. Michael and I felt increasingly distant from our former selves, as if an essential part of us had been taken during that expedition. The world around us seemed to have changed, but in truth, we were the ones who could no longer see things the same way. The experience in Yellowstone had left an indelible mark, and the internal transformation seemed irreversible. It was as if, somehow, that experience had changed us forever. Reflecting on all that happened, I came to the conclusion that this secret must be revealed, that the world needs to know what we witnessed, even if it comes at a high cost. The memories of that lab and what we saw down there are unbearable to carry alone, like a weight that grows with each passing day. Yet the promise made in George Mason's threat are still real, and I know that any attempt at disclosure could have grave consequences. Still, the truth cannot be buried forever. I write these words because I feel that time is running out, that something bigger is moving in the shadows, something that we may not be able to stop. Michael has disappeared, and his absence brings a sense of foreboding I cannot ignore. I feel that what happened to us in Yellowstone did not end that night, that it may be part of something much larger than we imagined. If anyone ever reads this, I hope they understand the gravity of what we faced. And if there is still a chance to prevent others from enduring the same, may this story be the key to preventing the worst.